it is my honor to be on this stage and to be welcomed so warmly on this stage. My honor to speak today in this city of Jerusalem, which is the home for all freedom lovers, city lovers, civilization lovers around the world. And it is my honor to speak under the umbrella of the Schusterman Foundation, which is so well known in America, in Israel, and in Europe as a very special philanthropy, dealing not only with philanthropy in general, but dealing with the attempt of making the young Jewish leadership to become more and more, to encourage them to be also doers, to do, to engage in the world, to be as much as possible activists of the freedom, of the democratic value, of the human value, under the umbrella and the flag of Jewish values. I understand that this is the commitment, more or less, of the Schusterman Foundation, and it is my honor and pleasure to conclude these days of reflection. As Emily just said, Emily just said, it is, I have to say a few words about myself, because I will not pretend to deliver a lesson. Who am I for that? But I will try to unfold an itinerary and to try to explain how a Jew like me works since decades in this world. As Emily said, my life since 40 years now has been divided into two. I am a philosopher, a writer, a novelist, whatsoever, and I am an activist. This is completely correct. I don't know if the two halves are equal, but it is clear that a big part of my life has been devoted not only to write philosophy books, but to try to put in practice, to transform into acts and deeds my ideas and values. Just now, I am back from a very strange, peculiar, and terrifying experience. I just shot another movie called The Battle of Mosul. I was, till a few weeks ago, embedded inside the special units of the Iraqi army, the Golden Division, filming the combats, filming the fights, filming the defeat of ISIS inside the city of Mosul, till the liberation, by the way, of the grave of the prophet Jonah. This is what I just did these last weeks. A movie came out of it. It was released in Europe. It was presented in Israel a few weeks ago at the Doc Aviv festival. Doc Aviv, I think it is all right. This is what I just made. Before that, it is true that I made other films. For example, when Sarajevo was under attack, under bombs, targeted by snipers, I was one of the few Westerners who broke the blocus, who entered by force of the mind, without weapon, of course, except that, in the besieged city, and I made a movie about it. Um, I remember how, you quoted it also, a few years ago, 10 years ago now, maybe 15, I devoted 1 year of my life. I quitted for a moment my work of a philosopher in order to document what I called at this time the worst forgotten wars in the world. The wars which do hundreds of thousands of victims, sometimes millions of victims, and which are not reported, which are not documented, which are not worth a narrative by most of the medias around the world. I made a book about that, which is available in English. I remember how I devoted another year of my life to go myself in Pakistan, not only in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, close to the very mouth, the jaws of the beast of Al-Qaeda at this time, on the footsteps of the American journalist kidnapped by Al-Qaeda, Daniel Pearl. I thought it was my duty at this time to retrace the last days of the life of this brave American journalist of the Wall Street Journal, Daniel Pearl, to understand why he was kidnapped and by whom, to go as close as possible to the, let's say, Al-Qaeda, in order to understand why this crime was committed. I did that. I did this investigation and I made a book out of it, and so on, since my early youth, 1971, when I engaged myself in the liberation of a not yet born country, which was to become the Bangladesh, part of Pakistan. There was a terrible genocide happening there in 1971, a genocide committed by the Pakistani army against a poor, miserable, forgotten people of Bangladesh. I engaged myself in a military unit of partisans of Bangladeshi, and I made a book out of that. So I devoted part of my life to these sort of crazy things. When I ask myself, when I try to understand why I did that, why I so often in my lifetime put myself in such strange conditions, I don't really need it. It is not my job. I'm not a journalist. I don't make my living by reporting about Bangladesh or by making a film about the fight of the brave Kurds against ISIS. So I do it for other reasons. Among these reasons, there is probably the will of embodying and glorifying the values of my home country, France, who has a sort of word to say to the world. There is certainly a commitment to human rights, the strong belief rooted in myself that humanity is not divided between those who deserve human rights and those who don't deserve. But I know, and I know more and more with the passing years, that a big part of my reasons is linked to me being a Jew. And I would like to elaborate a little about that. I know that, for example, I told you about Sarajevo. I was one of the first to enter in besieged Sarajevo, and I immediately understood, and it is more and more clear with the years, that if I had not been a Jew, Or at least, let's be precise, if I did not have in my heart, in my soul, in my memory, the idea, the souvenir of the Holocaust, if I was not aware of this possibility of mankind to commit the absolute evil, I would probably have not perceived, as I did in the very early times, the first mumbles, the first words, the first smells of a possible genocide. It was not a genocide, but it was a possible genocide. And I must say, I remember this month in Sarajevo. I was not alone, of course. There was the American writer Susan Sontag, who was there also, who was very different from me, very different commitments and position. And there was others. What we had in common, the journalists, the activists who were in Sarajevo, was this consciousness of the possibility of genocide. In different ways, we had in our flesh, in our memory, this idea that genocide was possible. So the memory of genocide, the memory of Holocaust, by the way, far from being a way to blind ourselves to the miseries of the others, is, on the opposite, a sort of warning signal, a sort of scale of the worst, which make Jews, or those who are aware of the Jewish suffering and experience, probably a little more aware of the worst. These forgotten wars I told you about, wars in Africa, the genocide of Rwanda and Darfur, wars in Sri Lanka, hundreds of thousands of deaths, unnamed, unnumbered, without any number. We don't even know if it is 100, 200, 500,000 victims, without graves, without names, without graves, without a precise figure in Sri Lanka. Nobody cared about that. In the middle, at the heart of the darkness of Darfur, of South Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, where no journalist went since 20 years, when I went there in 2001. What happened? Most of the journalists, at least the big outlets of the Western world, were shaped by an idea of history, the history, as it is conceived by the modern philosophical tradition, by the Marxist way of thinking, by the Christian way of conceiving the time, the history, as a big time going from a beginning to an end, having an internal meaning and sense. This is the history as it works. And in this sense of history, in this conception of history, the best form of it is, by the way, the Marxism. You have the sufferings, you have the victims, you have the battles that match with the sense of history, which fit with the general target of history, which have something to say about the big battle of the good and the evil. And you have the wars, you have the sorrows, you have the sufferings, which are overshadowed, which are out of the frame of the big narrative, of the big history of the big universal. This is the way the Western world works. Since Augustine, the Christian Saint Augustine, till Karl Marx, until today. There is a will of universality, a will of achievement, and in order to fulfill this will of universality, you have some major conflicts which say a lot, and you have minor conflicts who are meaningless regarding to this big narrative. I pretend that in order to disrupt this terrible law that condemns to darkness, to silence so many parts of the world, you have to have in your mind a different conception of history. You have to be animated by a quite different and specific idea of the time. And in mankind, you have not an infinite number of solutions. You have not just the choice, you have a limited possibility of choice. You have the Catholic conception of history, which goes to Hegel, which goes to Karl Marx, which goes to, at the end of the day, the realpolitik of our times. And you have the Jewish conception of the time, which the Jewish serious people called Messianism, and which pretends that, of course, the history has a sense, but that this sense is not a teleology, that this sense appears not by an increasing big ray of light, but by in scattered little sparks of truth, and that these sparks of truth can be here or there in the most enlightened part of the world or in the most cursed and forgotten part of the world. I pretend. And this is, by the way, what a great Jew, Walter Benjamin, demonstrated so brightly, that in order to hear the voice of the forgotten, the voice of the humiliated, the cry of the speechlesses, the one who are speechless, it is very useful, probably necessary, probably unavoidable to have the memory, and if possible better than the memory, of this alternative sense of history which is named by the Jews the Messianism. In order to deal, I was thinking a few weeks ago, I was in Mosul. I was blocked for a few days in an area, in a neighborhood which was supposed to be liberated. ISIS came back by tunnels behind us. Us means me, my crew, the little group of us, and the unit of the Iraqi armies who embedded us. ISIS came back on our back. I was stuck for a few days, and it was a very uncomfortable situation. And I was wondering, in the loneliness, fear, and silence of this situation, at the end of the day, why? Why is it in me who commits me to deal with this crazy city, with this crazy Iraqi nation? At the end of the day, they are not my people. It is not my country. They might not be my friends. They are a sovereign country. They should deal with their own matters. But my feeling was opposite. Why? I think, and I thought, during these days and nights of gloomy darkness, that again, to be enriched by the memory and the knowledge of Judaism, to be inhabited by Jewish values was far from being useless. Number one, because the experience of Jewishness, of Jewry, before Israel is a great achievement. Israel is a miracle. Israel is a huge metaphysical experience, maybe the most important of all our history since 2,000 years. But it is not the only part of Judaism. Judaism has said during centuries and centuries something else, which is that the nation, to be a nation, is not the last word of humanity. That humanity is not and should not be divided between separate, opposite nations left to their own destiny. This was a reproach, the grievance which Hegel, the German philosopher, made to the Jews. He said to the Jews, you are a devilish people, you have to disappear because all the people on earth are constituted in nations and states. You are a nationless, a stateless people. You are dealing with the affairs of the other states and other nations. This is not fair. This is not normal. You have to disappear. If really the destiny of the world is to build more and more nations, the Jewish people has nothing to do with the destiny of the world. Alas for Hegel, the Jews existed since centuries, not as a classical nation, but as a sort of grain of sand or grain of salt injected in all the other nations, a sort of argument against the tendency of every nation, every Gentile nation, to close itself in its borders and so on. And there is, in the Jewish tradition, in the Jewish text, this precise idea that the Jews are compared to a sand, that the descendants of Abraham has to be compared to the sand of the desert. That you have the peoples of earth, of deep, wet, profound earth, and that you have the light, sometimes invisible people of sand. This opposition between earth and sand, between the heavy materiality of earth and the fragile, frail, light, nearly immateriality of sand, which is a material but of a very different sort. All the Talmudist masters, a lot of them, reflected a lot about that and made this being a people of sand one of the most unique experiences of the Jews. In Mosul, during these 4 days, when I was rewinding, recalling my life of involvement in so many others' businesses, from Bangladesh to Libya to Poland to whatever, I thought I'm probably faithful to this commandment as being one of the humble witnesses of these people of sand. And again, the fact that I'm a Jew, the fact as I am knowing it or not, but I know it better and better, the heir, the descendant of this tradition has a lot to do with the fact that I am in Mosul. During my old time, in my youth, I was probably not aware. When I was in Bangladesh, when I replied to the call for action of a great French writer called André Malraux, I was unaware of my Judaism. I was a Jew, as Daniel Pearl said a minute before his beheading, I was a Jew because of my mother, because of my father. I was a Jew because I was born a Jew. But probably, in many regards, as Daniel Pearl, I was not really aware of what it meant. I was a non-observant Jew. I was a universalist Jew. I was an extreme leftist Frenchman. I never entered before 30 years old in a synagogue, and I never opened a holy book, but I pretend that for all the reasons I just told you, I was aware without being aware. I was unconsciously but deeply aware of this Jewish heritage, which I devoted the rest of my life, the following part of my life, to develop and unfold. So for me, far from being a contradiction between being a Jew and being an activist, the opposite. The two are completely interconnected, and they could probably not live one without the others. I'm sure that there is in this hall some of you who will probably ask, but are you really sure? Are you really sure? Are we really sure that a faith, a spiritual tradition, who speaks day and night about God is such a help in order to go to the other and in order to give back a speech to the speechless? At the end of the day, is really God the best tool? I did ask myself this question so many times. My reply is that to be a Jew is probably, certainly, to have a very special a relationship to this word, God, very different from what is understood under this word by Muslims and Christians, for example. And I do believe that to be a Jew is to consider that one of the biggest sins, one of the biggest faults of a man or of a woman is to consider our duties toward, let's say, God, more important than our duties toward the others. I could quote you tens of names of big masters and wise men of the tradition who say exactly that. That the obligation toward the other man, that the obligation toward the hungry, thirsty, not dressed woman or man comes before the obligation toward the sky or God. None considering the deep point, maybe we will discuss of that later. What do we Jew and do we understand the same when we say God? As for example, our Christian brothers, I am not sure of this at all. You will probably ask me and ask yourself, is it the best way to go to the others and to be an activist? To be part of a community, the Jewish community. Is that the best way? To be member of the Jewish community of America, of France, it is the highway toward the otherness. I ask myself this question, and my reply is yes, if you follow the real command, the real order of the prophets. Even if you are not a believer in God, this is another question. The text exists. If you follow the teaching of Isaiah, book chapter 56, that what we Jews have to do is not to build a house for ourselves, but to build a house for the rest of the humanity. Yes, if you follow the teaching of the prophet, which I was reading when I was in Mosul a few weeks ago, the prophet Jonah, when he says that the worst solution for a Jew is to remain prisoner of his community, which means prisoner of the belly of the whale. The belly of the whale, at the end of the day, if you read all the commentaries of the Meiri, of the Malbim, of all the Talmudic masters who have unfolded the wings of the spirit of the word of Jonah, they say that the belly of the whale is just a metaphor for a closed, separated, outnumbered community. So yes, member of a community, if you consider it as a start from where a journey has to be undertaken and accomplished, then yes, I think that to be a Jew is a good school for activism. One might ask, what has the Isaiah and the Torah in general to do? 5 minutes. What has it to do, the Torah, with activism? And is not the faithfulness to the book, to the Jewish book, again, a way to separate ourselves from the others? I don't believe so. And I believe that one of the most brilliant, one of the most enlightening explanation of what it means to read a Torah, a verse of a Torah, has been given in Rashi and in so many pages of the Talmud. It is one of the most recurrent wording of the Talmud, who says, to be a Jew is to read each verse of the Torah as if it had 70 faces. You all know this quote from Rashi. You find it in the work of the Gaon of Vilna and many others. To be a Jew, you may read, everyone reads the Torah. The Christians read the Torah, the Muslims read the Torah, the atheists, but the Jews read the Torah, say Rashi, in this special way to consist in reading it as if each of its words had 70 faces. When you reflect on this very strange word, you have to understand that face is already a very strange word, but this is another story. But 70 is the number of the nations, is the number of the non-Jew, of the Gentile nations, which means that to be a Jew, to commit part of our activity of our soul to the meditation of the Torah, means helping each of the 70 nations or their members to find their face, to discover their own subjectivity in the relationship, in the mirror of the Torah. Again, the question of the chosen people. This is the question I ask myself since decades. Is not this idea of being a chosen people in a living contradiction with the other idea of going to the others, opening our arms to the misery and suffering of the others? Yes, it is a contradiction if it is considered in a stubborn, fanatic, and literal way. No, if we consider that to be a Jew is never to consider literally all these sort of matters, and no, if we go really to the heart of the tradition, which says that to be a chosen people is a very complicated story, that the Hebrew words chosen to express this choice are words which designate the most open possible universality. If you consider, as I try to do in an essay, that the Hebrew had some words to express the exclusivity of a chosen choice. Behira was a possibility, but the Hebrew chose the segula, which means treasure, but not treasure for God, treasure of the other nations. I pretend that the idea of being a chosen people, the real meaning of this choice, this real meaning of this special place of every single Jew, if he really tries to understand what being a Jew means, the real place is probably to be a secret, treasured part of the other nations, escorting them silently, modestly, humbly in the work of their own redemption. I really believe that there is inside the Jewish wording that deep meaning. And at the end, I will finish with that, of course, the question of Israel. I am surrounded myself by people in my country and in America who tell me, but come on, how can you pretend to be an activist, to wish the best for the rest of the world? How can you pretend to defend the human rights, the democracy, the multi-ethnicity in the rest of the world if you are faithful to Israel? This is, again, another point, the most easy. I do believe, and this, I'm sure you know it, and I think you have to be, my advice, if I dare, proud of this knowledge, that precisely Israel is a support for this good. That Israel, far from being this apartheid country which is depicted by its enemies, is an example of democratic miracle, is probably the best achieved experience of multi-ethnicity in modern history. Israel, and I know again, alas, I went through so many terrible times in my life. I saw from so close all the evil which the man can do to the other man. I saw so many wars, in other terms, and I can say that even in these terms, Israel, far from being despised, far from being attacked or delegitimated by the liberals of the rest of the world. My friends, our friends, the liberals, Israel, far from being despised, should be praised by its deep faithfulness to the liberal values, and I mean liberal values in the American sense. Of course, what I just said means that the work we have to do, that the commitment which is your commitment is not only a commitment toward Bangladesh, Kurdistan, Libya, whatsoever. We have also a commitment in Israel. We have also a duty of intervention, of speaking loud, of defending highly some values inside the Jewish people. The intellectual war has to be waged also inside the borders, if there are, because for me there is no borders precisely of what is called the Jewish world. There is an ongoing battle for values. There is a strong, harsh, though brotherly battle on what it means to be a Jew today. No one is entitled, this is a principle of Judaism. We are not Muslims. We are not Catholics. We are not Christians in general. No one in Jewish world is entitled to say what it is to be a Jew. To pretend to have the good formula is a sin. To pretend to be able to give the law of a behavior and of a way of maintaining ourselves in the world is the most un-Jew way of dealing with humanity. But what is required from all the Jews of all tendency, is to open, to maintain, and to enlighten, and to put the fire in the intellectual dispute. Values against values. World against world. Conception of being a Jew with other conception of being a Jew. This is our duty. This is our commitment. This is the other part, I think, of your activism. Thank you very much. Sorry for my English. So, any question? Maybe the question could go close to the mic? What do you think?
We'll now be taking questions. If you have questions, you can come to the mic. But as a reminder, a question is a long statement about your life story or your opinions or beliefs with a question mark at the end. No, but in all seriousness, a question is concise and ends with a question mark. So please come and
you have
ask
to
any
run to the
question
mic.
with a question
This
mark.
is the only way. Okay, yeah.
Thank you very much for a moving and enlightening speech. You mentioned that there are two parts of your life. The part before you'd walked into a synagogue and engaged with the direct Jewish text and the Jewish world. And I wanted to know, what was the transition point? At what point did it shift? What made you switch to those two aspects of your life?
The switch was a philosophical switch. There is many ways to become a real Jew. There is many ways for a real teshuvah. You have spiritual ways. You have mystical experience. For me, it was a philosophical experience. I wrote my two first books without any knowledge of being a Jew. And I think that my most important book at this time, the book which made me a little famous all over the places, called The Barbarity with the Human Face, appeared suddenly. I had the experience of this book when it was achieved, when it was finished, was a sort of dead end. There was a huge obstacle at the end of the book, like a sort of mountain, not Sinai, Kilimanjaro, at the end of the book, a Kilimanjaro, which I felt I was unable to cross. The book was great. It was, it did change little things in the intellectual conversation in France, in Europe, and even in America when it was published in America and in Israel. But it was, there was a sort of dead end. Then I met, by the circumstance of the life, one of the most important French philosophers who happened to be a Jew and who happened to lead his thought on the two sides of the profane philosophy, Hegel, Heidegger, Marx, and the Talmudic work, Emmanuel Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas, he was making philosophy his philosophy in Greek and in Hebrew. On the two sides, his job was to take the two stones of the two big traditions, the Jewish stone and the Greek stone, and to put them together and to create sparks. I met him. We became friends. He took me by the hand in this difficult, he was the first one, path of not the knowledge, I was good in knowledge, but of the study in which I was totally ignorant. And under the influence of Levinas, and then a few others, I began to understand what was missing, not to my being. I was already a Jew as I described, but what was missing to my body of concepts, what was missing in my philosophy in order to advance. So I became a real Jew. I began to go inside the Torah, inside the Talmud, inside Rashi and others, in order to continue to make philosophy. This is the real story. Then I had a big part of my life where, because this is what I tell you is the beginning of the 80s, and I wrote a Jewish book at this time called Testament of God. Testament of God, it says a lot about my relationship to God, of course. And then it took me 35 years, to write my next Jewish book called The Genius of Judaism. In between these 35 years, during these 35 years, I wrote a lot of books. And I would say that these books were secretly influenced. There was in them some grains of the Jewish sand, even if they were not explicitly Jewish books. So I had a first work, un-Jewish. I have my last work, fruit of 20 years of work, Genius of Judaism. And in between, I have a rather big piece of work about Jean-Paul Sartre, about painting and art, about how to fight radical Islamism, about French, whatever, where Judaism is like, Jewish thought is like a living ghost, a living, omnipresent, though silently, ghost.
Hello. Thank you so much for that. That was really beautiful. Thank you so much. There are so many challenges in the world today. And obviously we can't address all of the challenges in the world. How do you choose where to focus your energy? How do you personally choose where to focus your energy? And what advice do you have for us? And how do we choose to focus our energy?
This is very hard to say for the others. For me, I know. I never know in advance, but I know when it is here. When I am with my little crew in the battlefield with the Peshmergas, I know that the real commitment was to try to do what nobody did, which was what nobody did, in the way we did it, which was to film the defeat of ISIS, which was to film the cowardness of ISIS, and so it is evident. Sometimes I had the evidence that the biggest commitment is to speak here, in this country, to contribute even slightly to the fact that Israel remains faithful to its true message and to its the true values of its founding fathers. Sometimes it appears evident, since 20 years, for me, that the real emergency is that. When I see, I don't want to make politics here, but when one sees so many ignorants who pretend to express the truth of the Jewish being, when you see so many irresponsible so-called literate Jews or so-called Orthodox Jews who pretend to know better than us what being a Jew means, I feel that I have to intervene. And so on. So it depends, really. It depends on the moment. It depends on the circumstances. It depends if you have something to say or not, if the life puts you in the situation to have something to say or not. I cannot make an ideal agenda of commitments. As for myself, I dream to contribute as much as possible to the defeat of ISIS, as I try to do already. I dream to help all those who in Israel are faithful to the true values to prevail. I would like to help that. I would like to help those who in the Golan Hills cure and save the Syrian refugees wounded by ISIS and Bashar al-Assad to recover and to go back in Syria. I wish to encourage them to give them the pride, to recognize the pride they already have, and to say how much they embody the best of the Jewish people. I dream, as for myself, about Israel. I told you about Israel, and I told you about what I call the forgotten wars. All these peoples, all these deads of the 20th and 21st century, millions of deads, without, as I said, without grave, without archives and names, without record, unrecorded, unburied, and not numbered people. These peoples, for me, are the best and the most natural allies of this country. This is a dream I have since long, that the great alliance, the most moral, the most matching with our Jewish heritage, and also the most useful, the most strategical and tactical would be the alliance with these cursed people. The most useful because at the end of the day, as you know, in the UN, it is not one man, one vote, but one country, one vote. You can be the little Burundi or the powerful America of Mr. Trump, you have the same vote. So I dream of that. I have a souvenir, by the way. You all know about Durban, the Durban conference in 2001. At the beginning of 2001, this Durban conference in South Africa, when Israel was demonized, when there was all these NGOs allegedly devoted to human rights around the world, fight against slavery, fight against racism, and so on. The only motto they were able to find was, as you know, one Jew, one bullet, one Jew, one bullet. This was Durban, a conference which was supposed to raise the question of slavery, racism, discrimination all over the world, and the conclusion was that there was one racist people in the world, people of Israel. This was the beginning of a new wave of world anti-Semitism, Durban. But my remembrance of this time, it was a very, very disruptive experience for me, as maybe for all of you, I don't know. My remembrance was, for me, the sorrow, my pain had two faces. I was sad for the Jewish people, of course, who suddenly became the unique guilty of all the evil in the world. But I had another pain, another sorrow for all the representatives of these people whom I knew for some of them, who came honestly, genuinely on this world stage because they really thought that their question will be raised. People from Sri Lanka, people from Rwanda, people from Angola, people from remote islands in Asia, a lot of people who are silent and intimated to be silent since decades, and they thought that they had for once a stage to express themselves. And I will never forget, for some of them, what they told me after, in the following hours or days, their despair, their absolute despair, this feeling that for the first time the world was going to take an awareness of their cursed destiny, and they were again eliminated from the stage. They were erased from the memory and the record of the modern humanity, because the only conflict which the world wanted to see was the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. So there was two victims in Durban. The Israel, of course, but also these millions, these tens of millions of victims in South Sudan and so many, Colombia, who were literally overshadowed, cast in the nothingness, precipitated in the abyss of the darkness by this big narrative monopolizing the world attention. And this day in Durban, I felt, I'm talking about my personal agenda, that between these two sorrows, there was a sort of familiarity, and that there was here a sort of necessary and natural alliance. And my dream, I said that to many political, I said it publicly, as I do today, I said it privately to a lot of leaders of Israel and of the Jewish world. My dream to see Israel taking the lead of the work of sorrow, of the work of memory, of the work of support in favor of these ignored and cursed people. This leadership, this great alliance is, if I had to express my own agenda, it would be certainly part of my personal agenda.
I'm very short, so I have to stay on my toes to make this work. We are very close to out of time, so we're going to have a challenge. We are going to have 3 people ask their questions at once now and see if we can respond in 5 minutes to 3 questions. All right.
You make the rule, my dear Emily. You are the one.
You know how to make my day.
I hope my question will be relatively short. Do you have any advice for us struggling to remain optimistic in such times?
So you're obviously a big contributor to world history and a great thinker, but I wonder what personally nurtures your soul to continue this work? What nurtures your soul to continue this work? Do you understand what I mean?
Merci, monsieur. My question is, what do you think the role of the Shoah is in modern Jewish identity? And do you think that it plays too prominent a role?
I don't think that Shoah is part of the Jewish identity. It's part of the Jewish memory. It's part of the memory of mankind. This part of the memory of mankind has to be worshipped by the Jews in particular, but not only. but I don't like the idea that it is part of our identity. We were Jews before the Shoah, the Holocaust. We would have remained Jews without Holocaust, thanks God. We would be 20 or 30 million more Jews if the Shoah had not appeared, 6 million plus their descendants. So I don't like the idea of Shoah being our identity. But I like the idea that we have a duty of memory, that we have this duty toward our families, if we have families who are victims, and toward the rest of the world. Because again, as I told you, I know I could demonstrate, not in 2 minutes, that the only way to resist the mass massacres of today, not only to resist, to get aware of them, is to have inside ourselves the memory of Shoah. So we are the guards of the memory. We are the best sentinels of this memory, but not the only one. And we should not be the only one. And very bad would be the time where we would be the only left sentinels of this scale of absolute evil, which helps to take the dimension of the evils of today. One question. The second question, what should we be optimist or not, and in which conditions? It depends what you mean. If being an optimist means that I hope for a reconciliated world where racism will have completely disappeared, where a world where there will be no one anti-Semite left, I'm not an optimist. I don't believe in fairy tales for a lot of reasons. But I am an optimist in the sense that I believe in a world where Jews, young Jews especially, will be more and more proud of their values. A world where they will contain more and more efficiently the anti-Semites and the racists. Not eradicate, contain. The fight against racism and anti-Semitism is not a matter of eradication, it's a matter of containment. An arm wrestling at the end of which they are weaker and the adversary of racism are stronger. I do believe in that, and I am optimist, last but not least, I am optimist if and only if we keep reconciling and thinking together what we call in America the liberal values and what we call here the Jewish values. If we leave the liberal values and the Jewish world to divorce, if we accept to see them antagonizing, then I am very pessimistic and it will be a catastrophe. If we continue the work of thinking them all together, then there is a big hope. And last question, what makes me, poor me, old me, what makes me continue? To be honest, I ask the question to myself very often. I don't really know, but if I had to say in one word, I would say that to be a Jew in the way I am a Jew, to be a Jew in my secular and I hope a little enlightened way, to be a Jew this way, helps me probably to proceed, to continue, and not to despair of the others and of myself. Thank you very much.